Welcome to Feminism Today, everyone. I'm Sophia Johnson in New York. President Joe Biden and First Lady Dr. Jill Biden traveled to Puerto Rico to survey storm damage and meet with officials and residents about the recovery efforts underway. The devastation caused by Hurricane Fiona has reopened conversations about the unsustainable nature of Puerto Rico's status as a colonial entity. Many are calling for statehood as a solution to bureaucratic challenges that slow down disaster relief. To learn more about the status of Puerto Rico's future and the island's political possibilities, we're joined now by Fernando Tormos-Aponte, Assistant Professor of Sociology at the University of Pittsburgh. Professor Aponte, welcome to Feminism Today. Delighted to have you back.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So first, our hearts are certainly with the people of Puerto Rico during this difficult time, the loss in this hurricane season, but also the ongoing loss. The island was inundated with heavy rains, huge amounts of rainfall, according to the National Hurricane Center. But very early on, the Biden administration approved a major disaster declaration for the island, opening up FEMA aid to assist individuals on the ground and also businesses. Tell us about what you've seen and what tears at you most in this experience.
It's devastating to think that Puerto Rico experienced just 5 years ago this month, or the month of September, a devastating hurricane of the magnitude of Hurricane Maria, and that 5 years from there, Category 1 hurricane, we're again in disastrous flooding and archipelago-wide power outage that is, of course, claiming lives, right? Outages claim lives. So it's devastating for the people on the ground and for those of us who observe what's going on and still have some hope that some progress can be made to make Puerto Rico more prepared for the increasingly devastating effects of climate change.
To the point that you just raised, more than 300,000 Puerto Ricans were without power immediately after Hurricane Fiona hit the island. It draws striking parallels, as you mentioned and pointed out, to Hurricane Maria, which devastated the island 5 years ago. Can we talk a little bit about the energy infrastructure? Where did we leave off in our last conversation?
Well, let me just say that the entire grid went completely out. There was no power after Hurricane Fiona, except for those who are able to generate their own power, whether it be through power generators or through renewable energy generation systems like solar panels and batteries to store energy. So there is that similarity in terms of Hurricane Maria. Another similarity is the flood damage. So Hurricane Fiona brought a lot of rain, and when you read the damage assessments from Hurricane Maria, one of the main drivers of damage was actually flooding, particularly for flooding around substations. So Fiona, in that sense, impacted Puerto Rico similarly than Hurricane Maria. The difference here was wind speed. So we didn't lose as many big transmission lines that take power from one side of the island where we have generation in the southwest, or the bulk of our generation in the southwest, over other parts of the archipelago that consume that energy. So in theory, we would have expected that first, folks didn't necessarily need to lose power. And second, if they lost it, it wouldn't have been for so long. But of course, there have been issues with the widely announced efforts to rebuild the energy infrastructure. And these issues are currently really being felt on the ground by ordinary Puerto Ricans.
For folks who may not be entirely familiar Can you give us a 1-minute history of the territorial status of Puerto Rico? Let's sort of put it in some context here.
Yeah, absolutely. Puerto Rico becomes a territory, a possession of the United States after the Spanish-American War in 1898. It has remained a possession and a territory of the United States since then. There have been Supreme Court cases that have provide further definition to the relationship, the colonial relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States. These are known as the Insular Cases. And I say a colonial relationship because it is still very much the case that the United States holds a colony in Puerto Rico and in other territories because it has complete political control over that territory. So much so that the United States, after Puerto Rico defaulted on many of its loans and was seeking to declare bankruptcy, but did not have the power to do so as a colony, the United States imposed on fiscal control board, and this fiscal control board was given power over Puerto Rico's finances. So Puerto Ricans lost one of the few autonomies that it still had, that they still had on the ground, which was to be able to draft a budget. They can still draft it, but it has to get the approval of this fiscal control board. The fiscal control board does not want to approve any budget that does not drastically cut spending. The problem is that among the things that are cut are essential services that are crucial for saving lives in the event of a major disaster. And with climate change, Puerto Rico is at the front lines of these extreme weather events. So we're really witnessing this tension between these policies that are adopted to try to resolve the fiscal crisis that Puerto Rico has experienced, in part because of this colonial relationship, and the need to preserve life.
What I'm hearing then, in the context of the US, there are certainly some democratic systems, but I'm wondering what this means in the most practical terms, in terms of democratic representation.
It means that Puerto Ricans have a very different experience with democracy than people who live in the continental United States. Why? Well, the sovereign of Puerto Rico is the president of the United States. Puerto Ricans do not elect this sovereign. Puerto Ricans also do not elect voting representatives in Congress. We can elect a resident commissioner who can participate within committees and who can present bills that must be but the resident commissioner has to seek co-sponsorship and support from colleagues in order to be able to advance any piece of legislation, and the resident commissioner cannot vote on the floor of the House for the approval of these kinds of bills. So this is how Puerto Rico is often in the situation of having to play U.S. politics, essentially, to try to seek attention of colleagues and people in already in Congress to try to act as representatives in solidarity with Puerto Rico or out of interest, right, in exchange for something. One of the things that often politicians in the mainland expect in exchange for collaboration and the issues of Puerto Ricans is to support them in their different races. So you have folks that are Puerto Ricans in the States that are Democrats and Republicans who have actually gone out and canvassed for Republicans and for Democrats in exchange for the support for the particular view for how Puerto Rico status should be resolved, whether it be through a state, whether it be as an independent country, or as something similar to what we currently have, which is this territorial status. And some have argued that that territorial status could be modified in some ways to make it a little more appealing to Puerto Ricans and a little fairer, more just. But that is a big debate, and a lot of folks have said that it's really not worth trying to be innovative and to change the territorial status in any other way than just independence or statehood, because this innovation is what led to the current status, whereby Puerto Ricans are really experiencing these democratic deficits.
Let's play devil's advocate for a moment. What difference does that make in a moment, for example, like Hurricane Fiona, Hurricane Maria, when maybe individuals with the identity of Puerto Ricans are kept from voting, are kept from representation in terms of House and Senate?
Yeah, it's a great question, really, because when you look at what drives disaster preparedness and recovery spending in the United States, one of the things that drives this is the extent to which the disbursement of this aid and the allocation of this aid is going to help electorally the elected officials who use their discretion to allocate this aid. For example, presidents are known to be more likely to issue disaster declarations for states where they feel like they have a chance to win in the upcoming election because they're competitive. They're also more likely to issue disaster declarations in areas where they want to reward those who supported them in previous electoral cycles. Well, in the case of Puerto Rico, this becomes a little complicated, right? Because you have this territory of Puerto Rico where you have more than 3 million people, but they can't vote in stateside elections, right? They can't vote for the president. But some have argued that it could matter the extent to which Puerto Rican issues matter to mainland voters. That's one way in which this could influence spending. Another way is that Puerto Ricans actually pack up and leave and they move to the States. And there have been massive waves of outward migration. In fact, more Puerto Ricans now live outside of Puerto Rico than they do in Puerto Rico, in part because of the economic conditions that the colony has imposed over Puerto Rico. So Puerto Ricans have built some political power in the States, and some folks argue that their use of that political power might make disaster aid distribution, might drive disaster aid distribution, right? Whether presidents or other agency officials are willing to spend money in Puerto Rico. So these are all different ways in which politics might be impacting how the U.S. government reacts to hurricanes like Maria and Fiona. But really, it's very complex because of Puerto Rico's colonial relationship and different from what you would expect out of a traditional U.S. state. What we know is that the patterns of inequality, of neglecting marginalized communities continue. And not just in Puerto Rico, they continue to be observed in the States. We know this from Katrina. We know this from the recoveries from Hurricane Harvey, Hurricane Irma in the States. So there are things that do happen, regardless of whether you're in a colony or not. And marginalized groups, people of color, minority groups, women, youth, they tend to be neglected in these recovery processes.
Now, there's a sense, and you tapped on so many, all of these issues. There's a sense that the disaster is the hurricane, the disaster is the flooding or the winds or the electricity. But what I hear is that there's another layer that needs to be unpacked. Can you just put a somewhat finer point on the economic crisis, which initially you said Puerto Rico found itself in, but how it is that Puerto Rico found itself here and how it is related to this subordinate status?
This is a great question, and I appreciate you bringing it up, because feminists in Puerto Rico have argued, and among others, and have said the disaster is political. It's not just natural. So a lot of folks have said that we should just stop saying that referring to disasters as natural disasters.
Yeah.
Disasters are also political, because the ways in which we experience extreme weather events like hurricanes is really shaped by what politicians choose to do and what not to do. Specifically, when it comes to the economy and how this impacts the recovery, Puerto Rico's colonial status has made it very, very hard for Puerto Ricans to develop an economy that can thrive. It's important to put Puerto Rico in the context in the broader global political economic context, right? One of the reasons for why the United States has been so interested in Puerto Rico and to try to show that Puerto Rico is a prosperous place is because they were trying to give the impression that capitalism was successful,
Yeah.
and that capitalism in the Caribbean and Latin America more generally was the way to go for Latin Americans. And they wanted to compare a place like Puerto Rico to a place like Cuba, where they wanted to point out that Cuba was under extreme misery because it was Soviet-led, because it was communist. However, after 1975, we start to see that the United States stops investing in with greater impetus in a place like Puerto Rico, and more policies are started to be adopted to try to address what a lot of people expected, which was a crisis, because we start to witness that growth was stalling in Puerto Rico, and later on it started to dip. So Puerto Rico was having a really, really hard time sustaining a prosperous economy, to the point where there were artificial injections of money through tax exceptions that brought in a lot of manufacturing companies that were setting up shop in Puerto Rico because they were able to get away with not paying taxes that they would otherwise have to pay in the United States, in the continental United States.
Yeah.
The problem with that is that it's actually not a sustainable plan for growth, because they're not leaving a ton of money in Puerto Rico by way of taxes, because they're experiencing tax exceptions, not just federal, but local tax exceptions, under the idea that this was the way to attract economic activity. So this injected a lot of money by way of income, right? And Puerto Rico was able to withdraw income tax revenue from those who were employed in these industries. But under the Clinton administration, they decided that they would actually eliminate some of these tax incentives that came through a section of the IRS tax code that gave Puerto Rico, gave companies setting up shop in Puerto Rico tax exception. When they eliminate this section, known as Section 936, Puerto Rico then experiences a major crisis, whereby people move, they lose their jobs. If you look at who leaves Puerto Rico, it's people who are working, it's the working age population who need to be able to sustain their lives and their families' lives, right? So those are the people that move. And once they do, you start losing a lot of that income tax revenue. And all of a sudden, the economy was no longer sustainable. So these are some of the ways in which that colonial relationship has impacted the extent to which the local government is able to make up for the inadequacies of the federal government when it comes to disaster preparedness and disaster recovery.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I mean, it also leans into what I see playing out in some of the CARICOM nations that are one by one, Barbados, Jamaica, sort of saying, you know what, we've had it with this Commonwealth monarchical structure. We're willing to sort of do this come what may. And so this idea of holding on to hope certainly makes sense. It's admirable. You know, President Biden, to pivot a little bit, President Biden traveled to Puerto Rico to reassure residents that federal government will help, right? As far as you're concerned, what is the priority for Puerto Rico at this moment, especially with the openness shown by the administration?
I think Puerto Ricans are looking for a very, very different experience from the Biden administration than the experience that they had with the Trump administration. One thing that I've been documenting in some of my writing has been that the Trump administration invested in intentional efforts to disrupt aid to Puerto Rico. Aid was allocated, but they delayed it and disrupted that disbursement. And this actually was one of the main reasons for why the recovery has taken so long, and why Puerto Rico wasn't prepared to handle a Category 1 hurricane like Hurricane Fiona. So folks are looking to the Biden administration and making sure to hold it accountable for what they said they would do. Biden administration has made explicit commitments to environmental justice, to correct the wrongs of the past of neglecting marginalized communities. And the Biden administration has announced infrastructure money to be invested in Puerto Rico. And they have announced that they will lead in the process of not just recovering from Fiona, but rebuilding a better energy grid. So some folks are understandably very cynical and skeptical about these commitments because it's not the first administration to make commitments.
Yeah.
And we know that we're very close to midterm elections, and that portraying the administration as caring can be very politically beneficial. But Puerto Ricans are wondering what's going to happen after the midterms. Are you going to be as excited as you are now when you need it? So we're seeing a lot of folks wanting to hold this administration accountable and being very, very cynical about the optimism that it has portrayed in terms of taking care of Puerto Rico.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. After Hurricane Maria battered Puerto Rico 5 years ago, Donald Trump complained that getting aid to an island of more than 3 million Americans, citizens, was just way too hard. What does the administration, whether it's Republican or Democrat, what do they get right or wrong on these campaign style walkthroughs, right? Like the one we're seeing here. What do they get right or wrong?
Absolutely. And just to react to the whole Trump administration's perspective that Puerto Rico was so far away, I think it's laughable from an administration that actually created a new branch of the military called the Space Force, and that they said that they wanted to go back on the moon and that they wanted to colonize the moon and Mars. So you're telling me that you're able to do all of this outside of our world, our globe, but you're not able to go to Puerto Rico, which you've held on to for centuries, and you still can't get to them? A lot of people find that to be absolutely ridiculous. So in terms of what these trips get wrong, look, it's hard for people to take these as genuine visits because it has been done before. Presidents come to Puerto Rico and go, and we're still in this place. And just like people are skeptical of the extent to which Democrats are going to do something about Black Lives Matter, and then all of a sudden they turn around and they're saying we need to fund cops and cops and cops. But where are the other solutions to the problem? This is the same thing. You see this optimism, and then you see that the promises aren't kept. So I think, this was to be expected, this visit. So close to the midterms. The opportunity to portray the administration as better than the Trump administration, as more caring. I think if the performance were to be followed up with actual investments and listening to people on the ground who are already experiencing it, investing in local thinkers, practitioners, community leaders, not just bringing everybody, all the experts in to Puerto Rico, but also lifting the ones that are already there who know the local context. I think that's when people would be less cynical about these performances.
Can we talk a little bit about the mental health toll of environmental, ethno-racial injustice? We hear the word resilience in response to Hurricane Maria and now Fiona and Ian. What is resiliency? Is this coded language for the expectation? Like, just how much bricks should be on our backs, really?
It's really sad because the idea of resilience, in theory, could be this vision for people being able to support each other, to be stronger together, to have collective means to save life and not just survive, but also to thrive, because survival is not enough. But people in Puerto Rico have really lost any interest in the idea of resilience, and instead they're saying, we need resistance. Resistance to the policies that are being implemented on the ground that take away resources from communities, and resistance to policies that think that the way to support coming out of the fiscal crisis in Puerto Rico is to do the same thing that has always failed forward, which is the idea of austerity and neoliberal policies that take away from higher education, that take away from healthcare, that made it so we had less people on the ground, less line workers, less frontline workers, that upon the onset of a major disaster like this could immediately be on the ground assisting folks. These policies have failed. And I think folks are no longer excited about the idea of the resilience, and instead they call for resistance and for new alternatives that are coming up from the community. But they haven't given up on holding their governments accountable. And folks on the ground have said that mutual aid and holding the government accountable should not be mutually exclusive, that this is a false dichotomy. And that we need to have this sort of joint approach where we keep supporting each other while also making sure that government meets their responsibility for people's survival and for people's ability to thrive.
Now, I couldn't wrap up this conversation without calling into this conversation Puerto Rican superstar Bad Bunny has been using his platform positively to bring awareness to Puerto Rico's political problems. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because this is the voice of the youth, the young people. So to the point is to this question of youth engagement in the movement, the advocacy coming out through music and cultural narratives. What should advocacy and activism look like in this moment when we have the attention of the Biden administration for Puerto Rico?
Activism in our times should look tactically diverse. And that means having people engaging in multiple types of activism and mobilization, but making sure that we coordinate across the different kinds of activism to make sure that we're collectively fulfilling an agenda for progress and for justice on the ground, justice for marginalized communities. So it's absolutely important to have people using their voice and their platforms to bring about some attention and highlighting the issues on the ground. We see this with celebrities, but not just celebrities. You know, we're seeing more and more folks really investing themselves in solidarity and not just charity, because folks have said, you know, charity really isn't enough. We need the means on the ground for people to be able to empower themselves. So it's not enough to just announce some new fund, although the money might be needed to support advocacy, to support advocates, right? Because people on the ground are burnt out. They're experiencing extreme exhaustion from the conditions under which they have to organize. So yes, supporting the right groups is absolutely important, but it is not enough. And we need to engage in coordinated political action that will bring about a different kind of activism, and one that is sustainable over time, and ultimately one that can be politically impactful at various levels of government, not just the federal government, because Puerto Ricans have not lost sight of the ways in which their own politicians are also betraying their causes.
Professor Fernando Tormos-Aponte, it's been an absolute pleasure. It's always a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for joining us again this week.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And that's it for our program today. Remember, you can follow me and the show on Instagram or Twitter. Thank you so much for watching Feminism Today on Free Speech TV. Join us again next week.